you a URL if it isn't actually live.
A quick question. I don't see a copy of the PDF for this article in today's directory or today's folder for the journal club. Is there a URL where I can go to for the PDF?
Yes, let me paste that into chat right now.
A quick question. I don't see a copy of the PDF for this article in, and it sounds like we do indeed have a live stream now because I just heard myself after a delay.
Sorry, so I just muted the live stream. I mean on my end, so okay.
Yeah. I don't even know where it is yet because I haven't got the URL for it.
Okay, let me give you that to you now then.
So the live stream seems to be working perfectly. The thing that we should still do, because of course nobody knows it's there, right, is we should post it to Facebook or something, or somewhere where we usually put these things. In fact, in future, if we're going to be better about this, just like we have in our events list, we have, the next event and whatever. Maybe the next event can also point to a journal club if the next thing coming up is a journal club. We need to advertise these better.
Okay, yes.
We could just try advertising the same way we advertise other events. In future. Of course, not today.
Okay.
You had a URL for the PDF for me somewhere?
I am getting that to you right now. Okay.
Great, got it. Okay, so was there anything else that you're still worried whether it works or not? Is it about getting the getting slides to show up properly on the live stream or something like that?
I guess it's probably a good idea to do that now. Let's see here. Trying to think of how I want to do this. Okay, yeah. We'll do it through.
I mean, don't worry too much about it. If you don't figure out how to make this work perfectly this time around, no worries.
Okay, so I have the Google Meets going through the OBS Studio, so let's see. I suppose it would be. Let's see if I. Okay, yeah, so I'll present in Google Meets, and so it's still going through OBS Studio, but then also everyone can just follow along with the slides in real time rather than looking at them on YouTube. So um, what I will do.
Yeah, I think for the purpose of this journal club, you should focus primarily on just doing everything through Meet. Um, and whether the live stream ends up working out as well as we'd like it to is kind of the secondary thing at the moment.
Okay.
But in future, or typically, what we'd want to do is we want to run the journal club live stream thing just the same way we do with events.
Okay.
Like, I can see how that can be a problem, though. I mean, if you're doing it as just one person presenting and running the live stream.
Okay. So on the YouTube, after 15 seconds goes by, can you see the first slide of my presentation?
I'll let you know.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like it's showing up.
Okay. Um, let's see. I'll just see here. I'm getting some kind of an echo. I'm not sure where that's coming from, or if it's just multiple people joining the.
Yeah, there's some people joining right now. That could be part of it.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, so I'm still presenting my screen. I think since everything seems to be working, I can just stay on the. Uh, wait. I just want to make sure that I'm still. No, I just want to make sure that I'm still. Okay, yeah, everything looks good. Okay, then. Okay, so I just won't be able to see Google Meets since I'll be presenting and well, I guess I can just, I guess I don't have to start presenting yet, so I can, I was going to say, because once I start presenting, I won't be able to see what's going on in Google Meets because it's going to be showing my entire screen.
Yeah, that's what I meant by it's a little difficult for the same person to be OBS live streaming and to be presenting as well. We should have arranged this in advance so that I was ready to do the live stream for you.
Hmm.
So don't worry too much about it. Focus on the Meet thing, I guess. Just make sure you can present to the people who are here. We'll fix that other stuff later.
Okay. Let's see, I suppose we'll wait just a few more minutes.
Yeah, another minute or two.
Okay.
Welcome everyone who happens to already be here. Michael is going to be presenting to us momentarily on neural correlates of consciousness. Michael, I just switched to phone because the audio was a bit better for me.
Okay. I think maybe we can just go ahead and get started. Randall, can you see my first slide again on the YouTube?
I have to get my laptop back online again, too. Can someone else perhaps verify? Maybe Michael Cerullo. Can you see it?
I'm actually just on the other link. What's the link to the YouTube? I'll take a look.
Let me get that for you. Let's see here.
Now, should we be watching it here or on YouTube?
Um, uh, for the Carboncopies members, if you watch it through the Google Meets, that would be easier. Then it will be in
Okay.
real time.
Well, I guess I could just search Carboncopies. Oh, okay. I see it right here. Well, I don't see the slides. I can hear it. It's a couple seconds off. Maybe 20 seconds behind.
Let's see. I'm posting. Oh, you found it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me. Okay, sorry for that delay. I have the slides back up.
It's good. Ready when you are.
All right. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the Carboncopies Foundation Journal Club, January 12th, 2020. I am Michael Ulrich, and I'll be your presenter for today. Just reminding for our Carboncopies Journal Club meeting agendas, it will be the entire time will be about an hour to an hour and a half long. The first 30 minutes will be for presentation, and any questions may be asked by the audience during the presentation at that time. It's an open discussion. And then after the presentation, we'll have the second half designated for discussion on the topic and any questions that were prepared by the audience may be addressed. And also any questions from the YouTube chat that are posted, I will address those as well. And then before closing today, we'll pick a new presentation. We'll pick a new presenter for the Journal Club meeting for the month of February. And the article that I will be discussing today, the neural correlates of consciousness meet the theory of identity. It's a 2018 paper by Michael Pollack and Thomas Marvin. So a little bit of introduction first for the neural correlates of consciousness. So a great challenge in consciousness research is finding the relationship between the states of consciousness and their implementing substrate, namely the human brain. The authors of this article are arguing against causal neural correlates of consciousness as a satisfactory explanation for consciousness and brain relations. Instead, they argue that the theory of identity of mind is critical for understanding consciousness, namely the relationship between consciousness phenomenon and states of neural states. And they suggest that scientists should engage more with the metaphysical issues concerning states of consciousness and brain function when doing consciousness research. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to be speaking from the point of view of the author. And so once I am finished presenting about the article, then I'll give my personal reflections on the content of the article. So the mind and body relation needs some clarification. Studying brain imaging data that highlights locations of the brain activity during states of consciousness has given huge insight into relationships between certain states of consciousness that activate the correlating locations on the brain. But there is no consensus on there's no definitive consensus on how to interpret the data to pinpoint exactly where the neural consciousness coordinates are exactly. The relationship between the states of consciousness and the active locations on the brain need to be further clarified. Also, the connection between mind and body is probably higher than just a brute correlation of the states of consciousness phenomena and the states and the neural states. So for defining the NCCs, the authors stress the definition of the NCCs in their article. A neural consciousness correlate is a neural activation, whereas there is a mapping for each neural token of the neural activation to be minimally sufficient for a phenomenal token of a phenomenal type, where all and only neural tokens of the neural activation instantiate a neural mechanism such that the neural mechanism is a sufficient condition for being a neural consciousness correlate of the phenomenal type. So the materialistic views, this is the understanding that all states of consciousness are caused by NCCs. Phenomenal states are not immaterial. There is no mysterious immaterial aspect of consciousness that cannot be defined as something that is going on in the neural function of the brain. And this is the typical view for current consciousness research, and it is appealing to treat brain states as the causes of the states of consciousness. By the view of the author, this view is problematic in that neurophysiological processes cause states of consciousness, but every conscious state must be implemented materially. There must be a distinct material process distinct from its neural cause to produce a conscious state that is different from its neurophysiological cause. And so thus we have two material processes. The underlying cause, but then also the cause to the effect, which the effect is the consciousness phenomenal state, but then also the mechanism, the mechanism that goes from the cause to the psychological state. And so the causal neural correlates of consciousness refer to the first of these two material processes. However, scientists, the first of these two. However, scientists are searching for the second materialistic cause, which bridges the gap between the neural state and the phenomenal state of consciousness. For example, the causal neural correlate of consciousness, for example, C fibers, which are a subset of neurons on the spinal cord that respond to pain. In this case, the C fibers would be the causal component, and then the psychological state would be the one that follows, but the C fibers are not responsible for the mechanism as is shown in MRI imaging. It is mostly, probably lies in the prefrontal cortex. So given this example, the C fibers do not satisfy as like a basic cause relationship for the material aspect of the phenomenal state of consciousness. The causal neural correlate of consciousness operates in real time, and these are considered the upstream correlates, which, going back to the C fiber example, and the downstream correlates of consciousness are the neurons that respond to these initial activations. In the C fiber example, namely, this would be the neurons in the prefrontal cortex. But according to the author, the true neural correlates of consciousness are what remain after cutting off the neural antecedents and consequence. A true neural correlate of consciousness, which the author refers to as the identity correlate, is what is captured by the mind-brain theory of identity. So consciousness needs a notion of type, and scientists aim to generalize the correlations between the types of phenomenal states and the types of neurophysiological processes. These assigned correlations must be repeatable as well. And designating consciousness types can begin very cruelty, since types of consciousness can be broadly defined and very general. However, it is definitely a necessary prerequisite for an empirical study of consciousness. And so a general correlation would be wherever a phenomenal type A, which is the defined or loosely defined type of phenomenal state of consciousness, a present neurophysiological type B must also be present, namely the corresponding neurons that activate to produce said consciousness phenomenal state that the person experiences. And types will not be sufficient for instances of consciousness. The types are definitely useful for generalization of the states of consciousness. And again, they are also generalized. For an example, pain and seeing color are two very generalized types of phenomenal states of consciousness, but they can't provide distinct differences to categorize them as totally separate types with distinct types of correlating neurophysiological types. The notion of type in the neurophysiological sense is underspecified. And for instance, pain and seeing color are going to be different per individual, but also they have neurophysiological states that perhaps share some similarities in them. And so categorizing phenomenal types can be done with a hierarchy system, At the top of the categorization are the very general types of phenomenal states, such as you could just easily relate that to like five senses: pain, visual perception, taste, auditory perception, but also depression and things like that. And so, taking pain, for example, again, if you were to go down the hierarchy, we can under just the general category of pain, you could say sharp pain, burning pain, cold pain, throbbing pain, or sore pain. But you can also get to a minimal kind of type where that type can no longer be distinguished from any other sensations. For example, if a person feels a sharp pain because they got cut with a knife, but they didn't know like that it was a knife, but they also got cut with, say, a needle, but they experienced the exact same kind of pain, that would be a minimal kind of type that didn't have any consciousness phenomenal state dependent on the external cause. And so, as stated, knowledge of the cause should not be required to classify that type of phenomena. For example, the taste of coffee, that can be something that can just be defined by its the phenomenal conscious state. You don't have to bring in the cause of tasting coffee in order to define that phenomenal state. It is just simply the taste of coffee. And neurotypes, the theory of identity gives a corresponds between phenomenal and physiological types at each level of generality. And it's not obvious which phenomenal types match which neural types. Neural types is usually defined by their neural mechanistic characteristics. For example, the C fibers experiment. Neural correlative consciousness research aims to find the correlations between these neural types and the phenomenal types through recognizable patterns. And localization of those types has been the main focus. Using MRI scans, seeing which regions of the brain and specifically which groups of neurons activate during specific testable states of consciousness, can show which areas are responsible, perhaps, to general types of conscious phenomena, but it is still and also those can be repeated, but is still not absolute, in that you cannot completely define which neural states are exactly corresponding to that specific type of conscious phenomena. And for example, if you take in the plasticity of the brain, where if a patient loses half of their brain, there is that instance where the rest of the brain can repair itself to take on functions to be able to have that individual still be able to have normal conscious thoughts, but it is a completely different type of neural state from a patient who has absolutely no brain damage. So the plasticity plays an important part in showing that the repeatability of noticing which neural types corresponds to which consciousness phenomenal types is definitely not absolute, and definitely not the same per every tested subject. So phenomenal and neural, classifying both of the taxonomies can't be done separately to produce a correlating classification of types.
Michael?
Yes.
What I'm going to say is not really a question so much as it is a something that I would suggest or propose to those of us who are listening, because there's so much detail involved in this discussion. As I'm not, even as a neuroscientist, I don't feel as comfortable constantly talking about the abstracts of, say, finding a neural correlate of this and that, and then whether it's different from one individual to another and its persistence and being able to discover it again. Sometimes, to me, it helps to try to put the same question in a different context that is just much simpler. Like, for instance, computer programming. If we think about the same sort of question, instead of looking for consciousness, if say we were looking for a correlate for the Tetris program in a computer. Now, from computer A or computer B, it might have been loaded into a different part of the memory. So you might find it in one piece of RAM or in another piece of RAM, and it's not like you can easily distinguish whether the transistors are different for running the Tetris program or running the Word program. So when you think about it in that context, when you just kind of think, oh, what would it be like if you were trying to discover the transistor correlates of the Tetris program, then a lot of these questions about finding the neural correlates, about consciousness, and the questions of what's it like from one individual to the next, and repeatability and all that, I find it helpful sometimes to just kind of compare those and think, hey, what would this be like if I was thinking in terms of programs, to see if the questions make sense. So I just wanted to put that out there as just a helpful, potentially, for some of us, potentially helpful suggestion.
Okay, yes, thank you. And so I also taking like a computer, for example, going back to research and trying to discover like the correlations between as far as in neurology, if the correlation between what neuron groups in the brain are active for specific types of consciousness states, say again, like going back to the example of pain, you could compare it in the computer. You compare it to trying to see which like states in the computer, like maybe aspects of memory, are active during certain known outputs of the computer. And in this case, it would be like a reverse engineering point if you knew nothing about computers, or I suppose if you could say if you knew as much about computers as you did about the human brain. And like in computers, if like the information is stored somewhere else in the computer, but gave you the same output that you expected, that would not be something that is a repeatable observation, and so therefore you would not be able to properly define that specific area on the computer as a responsible cause for the expected output. And so again, with researching the activity of the human brain, it is still not clear which areas of neural activation are responsible for certain types of consciousness states. It's definitely you can localize it in that there has been repeated observations, but again, with the plasticity of the brain, but also with like corresponding activating types of neurons that also contribute to different states of consciousness, it is still difficult to define which are responsible for which states of consciousness, which expected states of consciousness, but also because those states of consciousness that you are testing probably aren't the same for the observed individual, especially if they are different individuals, because classifying those types of phenomenal states are definitely very general, but definitely not. But there's definitely some difficulty in defining phenomenal types, phenomenal states precisely, so that you can get a precise repeated observation for observing the activated neuron groups in those experiments. And so hypothesizing mind and brain identities cannot affect empirical research into the neural correlates of consciousness in any negative way. The author is saying that giving theories to those correlations between the states of consciousness and also the neural states isn't going to affect the observations, but rather it's going to help guide them. And a quote from the author: "It seems to be clear, though, that we can only reach this endpoint of inquiry by working first with correlated phenomenal and neural type taxonomies, and gradually isolating the common neural mechanisms that they all share." And so, a plea for the identity theory. The great deal of empirical research between neural and phenomenal types is not enough without being able to interpret the data that is being collected. So to classify the correlating states of phenomenal and neural types as the same things bring about the identity. And so that is what the author's theory of identity states, is that in regards to understanding the correlation between neural and phenomenal neural states and phenomenal neural type states and phenomenal type states, they're not separable. They're simply just the same thing, and this corresponds to the extreme side. A complete side of the materialistic viewpoint, in that all phenomenal states are there isn't anything immaterial about them, that they are all tied to actual correlating neural states that are going on in the brain. And but I think more importantly from the author's view is that there shouldn't be any difference between, as far as classification, between the what is going on neurally and what is going on in the state of consciousness. And the author then compares this identity theory classification to other theories that are somewhat like the identity theory, and the first one out of three that they compare it to is constitution. And so the constitution refers to a one-to-one relationship between the distant entities, and they use an example of a lump of clay and a statue, and their comparison is their location with each other. They say that if even though their relation is the location states, if the statue changes, then it becomes a different form, but the lump of clay still just remains a lump of clay. And so by this, the constitution theory for the relation between the state of consciousness and the neural state is not appropriate for characterizing the mind-body relations. Transformations, the neural patterns will either change the identity of both the neural state and the phenomenal state, or if the transformations are radical enough, they will erase either the mental state or both the mental and neural state. That means that the constitution does not address the mechanism for the correlation. It does not give enough grounds for understanding why there is that causal change from the change in the neural state to the conscious state. For instance, if the in regards to a computer, if a certain program is executed to give you a certain output, just based on constitution, you could say that, well, this certain program, their relationship is this output, but this does not explain what would happen if there was a change in the program. So why would that give a change in output? And so the second theory that the author compares identity theory to is multiple realization, which states that the phenomenal state can be realized in different substrates, not just in human brains, but also in the brains of some animals and even artificial systems such as robots. In this case, it is a type to multiple type relation, which is the type of phenomenal state to multiple types of neural states. it allows for one phenomenal type to map to multiple neural types, and so they use the example of, well, in principle, this means that the same phenomenal state of consciousness, just let's just say like a sharp pain, that same phenomenal state of consciousness can be felt by other neural states, like even in different animals and in humans, you could say different individuals. And the author gives an example of an experiment with ferrets, where in a controlled group of ferrets, some of them, their neural pathways were altered so that I believe it was their visual input was reversed, and so the ferrets that had that surgery that changed that neural connection, they eventually adapted to have proper functions based on that impairity by the brain's plasticity. But the author argues that in that experiment, it doesn't satisfy because the ferrets that had that altercation still had deficiencies in their actual ability to still perform that function, even though that they were given that alteration. And so it is inefficient to say that they had the same kind of phenomenal state of consciousness. And so to clarify the author's argument against multiple realization, whereas you can have the same state of consciousness over different types of neural states, or even different like substrates, like animals or even artificial intelligence systems, they say that the type of phenomenal state produced is not the same thing, because the neural state still has to be exactly the same to produce that. It can only produce one type of phenomenal type, or to be more specifically, only one type of phenomenal consciousness type can be produced by that by only one neural type, because those are the same thing, that there is no differentiation between them. And the third theory that they compare identity theory to is the theory of supervenience, which claims that the phenomenal states supervene on neurophysiological states if and only if any change in a phenomenal state is conditional upon a corresponding change in the neurophysiological state. This is very much like the identity theory in that they say that only one type of neural state can correlate to one type of phenomenal conscious state, but they are saying that they are still not the same thing. And so, according to the author, there is still that something else that is still missing from that. That they say that there's that mechanism to go from the neural state to the conscious state that simply supervenience doesn't satisfy. It is a weak version of identity theory in that the supervenient states and processes are ontologically dependent on their subservient basis, but they cannot be reduced to them. And so you cannot reduce the consciousness states simply down to the neural states. And so the identity theory accommodates for all of the phenomenal properties in the material world, yet the supervenience theory leaves their ontological statuses unexplained. And so the mind-brain theory of identity is intended as a means of overcoming the philosophical obstacles of the empirical study of consciousness. The philosophical concerns of mind-body relationships must be taken into account when conducting conscious research. Neuroscientists could bring clarity into their theoretical commitments by bringing in these concerns. Furthermore, the theory of consciousness needs to be clear about the notion of type. That it needs to be that states of consciousness needs to be properly classified, and also a system of hierarchy is one way to do that. That could help clarify that type level correlation between the phenomenal and the neural taxonomies. So to kind of clarify, the mind-brain identity theory is a way to define the correlation between neural states in the brain with their corresponding states of consciousness as simply that they are just the exact same thing. This is the materialistic, I suppose you could say extreme, that there is absolutely that there should be no difference treated between them, and that there is nothing special about the state of consciousness that cannot be corresponded exactly to the physical or material neural state, and that this is the author clarifies that this is a proper way of neuroscience research, in that treating the material neural states as exactly the consciousness phenomenal states would help guide any philosophical issues that are concerned with making that correlation between the consciousness states and the neural states. And so now I'll just give my initial inflection on that. What I seem to have an issue with is their pointing out that the connection between the neural states and the consciousness states, that they should just be treated as the exact same thing. I don't see. I'm not entirely sure why that is as important, and as the author is claiming that it is, as far as when conducting research, and that is because I agree that they are definitely both materialistic, that there is no immaterial in consciousness, but I don't see why treating them as the same thing helps with making that correlation, because consciousness states can't be looked at the same way that neural states can. They have to be treated as separate forms of observation, the same way you would treat neural states in a different way, in that states of consciousness, the phenomenal states of consciousness, defining those takes more of a philosophical standpoint. You have to be able to define what kind of state you are trying to observe, and you have that definition, but then you also have a hypothesis of what neural state that would correlate to. So treating them as the same thing is granted important for making that correlation, that there is no separate mechanism for turning a state of consciousness into a state. I mean, there is no there isn't something immaterial. But you can't just say that they are the same things and get rid of the philosophical obstacle, because defining states of consciousness, you still have to use philosophy in order to define what it is that you are researching. And I guess what I will say, what I do also like, what I like about this paper is the author's proposition that there should be a clarification of types of consciousness. I like his hierarchical approach because uh, you could it might not work the same way for I mean, it might not correlate very well for when you have the same kind of hierarchical categorization for the neural states, but giving that clarification would at least help guide the types of consciousness states that you are observing, and especially if you got down to a point where you can like give minimal types, things that cannot be broken down into further types, then you could say, okay, this is one type of consciousness that we can look for, and we don't have to look any like lower than that state.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. By the way, I just want to quickly throw in there that where you talk about minimal types of consciousness or minimal states, if we imagine, for instance, what that might be, this is where I seem to run into the problem that you already pointed out, that making phenomenological conscious type equal to, or state equal to the neural, whatever the neural correlate is of that, making it exactly equal, this makes it very difficult to come up with some sort of minimal set that you can talk about, because I don't know how to say this well in terms of consciousness, but if I just switch over to vision for a second so that we have something to compare with, let's say that you have something in vision, a phenomenon that we call recognizing cars. Okay, so we can talk about that. That's useful to say, here's recognizing cars. Maybe in consciousness it would be something like experiencing pain or experiencing sharp pain. If I were to say that in vision, that the experience of recognizing a car is equal to the neural correlate, in the precise neural correlate, as in which neurons are active and exactly what they're like and which dendrites they have where and all of that, then I would only be able to say, okay, here's my neural correlate for the visual experience of seeing that particular Toyota Corolla. I wouldn't be able to say, here's my neural correlate for being able to see cars, because you would no longer be able to abstract away from that very detail, that granular level. You wouldn't be able to make a scale separation somewhere. And I think that's what we do try to do when we talk about either vision or consciousness. We try to separate scales somewhere and say, okay, below this level, it's really immaterial. In order to recognize cars, it doesn't matter so much whether you can recognize if this is your neighbor's Corolla or your own Corolla or something like that. That's a different question. So that's where I agree with you on the problem of making it so rigid that you say exactly, neural correlate equals phenomenological conscious experience. Although, of course, the connection with the mechanism is nice. I do like that we are now, and this is not specific to the paper, but I like that we're now talking about identity and consciousness, so that we're beginning to separate those two things. Because even in this paper, or the way you described the paper, there's this discussion of how you can find the same kind of phenomenological conscious experience across even different species, not just different brains of different people. So, a ferret can experience sharp pain, and a horse can experience sharp pain, and a human can experience sharp pain. These can all be conscious experiences. And that's something that we would say, okay, this falls within the topic of consciousness. But that does not fall within the topic of identity as such, because that horse is not equal to that ferret, is not equal to that human. So then you start to see that there's a difference between these two things when we talk about them. And it's very dangerous that people have a tendency to just lump it all together and say my consciousness when they mean my identity. So that was just another thing I just want to throw in there. I'm glad that we're talking about those two different things. And then finally, one more observation I just wanted to throw in the ring is the more I've been sort of using this computer program analogy or whatever as a way to think about the problems that we're talking about here, the more I realize that problems of identity have been dealt with in programming in a way that we haven't yet really adapted to philosophy, or at least not all of us. So, for example, when a program is changed, plasticity, right? You've got program code. Let's apply some neural plasticity to the program code. We update a function somewhere. what do we do in software engineering when we've updated a function in a program? Well, this program is no longer version 1.0. It's now program version 1.01a. We've given it a slightly different moniker. So you could say its identity is not exactly equal to what it was previously, but it's clearly derived from. It has the same ancestor. So if we were talking about Mike Cirillo's way of looking at things, you could say there might be a sort of the same kind of dependency that you would find between different nodes or branches in identity as you're progressing along in life. And I wish people would apply at least the same amount of precision in their thinking about identity to that in philosophy, neuroscience, and just mind uploading and all of that as they do already in computer programming, because at least that would raise the level of discussion beyond the sort of discussion where there's just some sort of very general mishmash about what is equal and what is not equal. Anyway, rant off. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. And yes, and really, first going back to as far as whole brain emulation and the hierarchy of consciousness types, I suppose one way of building an emulation is if you could define all of the consciousness types down to a minimal level. If you did not need to know what the neural state was that corresponded to that, but if you were able to construct the artificial substrate with a program that could yield that same minimal state, then if what we are concerned about is, at least as far as emulating consciousness is concerned, if you are simply focused on emulating that consciousness, then that would be sufficient as a different kind of substrate than the neural state, and that's so going back to the.
But Michael, just a second. So I'm not an expert at this, and maybe Mike Cirillo can jump in to correct me. But I find it confusing that people will use the term consciousness to describe themselves, to say, this is my consciousness, and when I want whole brain emulation to be done, I want my consciousness to be replicated. Because that seems bizarre to me. When I think about conscious phenomenology, I may think about something like, that made me happy. I'm experiencing the conscious phenomenon of happiness right now. Now, what made me happy? What made me happy is that I just saw my grandmother. Okay. Now, someone else on the street could also just be happy right now, and it might be for some completely different reason. It has nothing to do with my grandmother. Now, the reason why I became happy because I saw my grandmother is because there's a huge set of neural circuits in my brain that have memories with my grandmother, and also a visual object recognition system that allowed me to recognize my grandmother. And all of that was tied into positive affect that then got reactivated, and that's making me happy. Now, so I'm having the conscious phenomenological experience of happiness, which is a very general thing. Bill and Dave and John over there, they can all experience phenomenological conscious happiness as well. But it's tied into a completely different set of stuff that really is my identity. And the identity is really my memory, because that's my memory of my grandmother and all those associations with those positive affects, etc. Whereas the consciousness is this very simple, basic little thing that just has stuff in it like sharp pain, happiness, and all that other blah blah. So when people talk about their consciousness as being this enormously important thing that needs to be perfectly replicated in order to have whole brain emulation done, it feels to me like they're talking about the wrong thing. Because consciousness is the thing we share with ferrets and rats and horses and dogs, probably to some degree, and certainly with all other humans. And it's very similar across humans. That's why we can sort of recognize it in each other and empathize. But it's those very specific memories that are the thing that makes it unique to me when and why I experience one of those things. And that's where, to me, the discussion about identity and consciousness, they kind of go in different directions. And identity will have to include memory. And that's where, I feel like we have to be very careful how we're stepping through this territory and about the terminology we use. And I raise this because you then started talking about what it would take in whole brain emulation to successfully replicate your consciousness. And I was wondering if you really meant to say your consciousness, or did you mean your conscious experience plus, your whole identity based on your memory and so forth. And again, I invite Michael Cirillo, who is more of an expert on this, to jump in and correct me. I may have just guided us in entirely the wrong direction. But I feel like that's something that it kind of muddles the conversation a lot when people talk about consciousness, identity, memory, and all the other stuff.
So just to answer what I was referring to, I was referring to just the conscious awareness, just specifically emulating that in regards to that, which also tied to that kind of hierarchical system, because the consciousness states, again, as far as just the conscious awareness, seems like that can actually, you can use that hierarchical system to categorize the minimal consciousness states. And so if you had those minimal conscious states that couldn't be broken down any further, then you could at least have an output that you wanted produced. Just quickly going back to referring that to creating a program in an artificial substate, if you could create a program that could replicate that without knowing what the neural states were, then maybe I was proposing that could be one way of at least emulating that, again, just referring to that conscious awareness aspect, that maybe you didn't have to know exactly what the neural states were. And then going back to tying that into identity, I completely agree. Yeah, that the conscious awareness is only a part of the if it even is if it even is a part of what you would define as identity, because it seems like more of the it seems like more of what you would refer to as the personal identity's ability to relate to the outside world is their state of consciousness. And so referring to how you could categorize consciousness definitely doesn't seem like it would pertain to categorizing the other aspects that make up personal identity, like memory, or how memory is translated into actions and desires, or actions and feelings and emotions. So referring specifically at least to just the consciousness part of it, that could be maybe a beneficial aspect, is knowing the minimal type. And so, but yes, for as far as identity, there seem to be categories in and of itself, which, given my knowledge, you could say there's memory. I guess you could include consciousness, and then also, I don't know what you would refer to as, or I don't know what you would refer to in between, makes up your personality, like what you do with those memories, or how those memories influence you. But it also seems, though, like those other aspects of identity besides consciousness are so much more difficult to measure, because at least with consciousness you can use the external. Since it's conscious awareness, you can use the external, the external world as a control for testing certain conscious awareness states in the subject patient, but trying to control what they what they pull back from their memory, or like trying to control how they think about a certain person and measure that is a lot more difficult because there seems to be that part of the identity, well, the part of the identity that is not, I suppose you could say, categorized as direct influence to the outside world, outside of the conscious awareness, that is going to be a lot harder to measure as far as finding the correlation between those neural states and I suppose you could say things like memory states or cognition states. Obviously, that's probably not the right terminology. Um, but yeah, so I guess Mike Cirillo, if you had something to add, I'll stop rambling and let you give your input if you had something.
Yeah. Well, first, yeah, no, thanks for the article and the presentation. I actually really liked this article. Can you pull up the article, or is there a way for me to share my screen? Because I just wanted to pull up a couple of things.
Yes, let me.
Or if you can get it, maybe just figure 3 initially. I think it's a great summary.
Oh, figure 3. Let's see here.
Yeah.
Figure or.
Oh, yeah, in the paper.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's see. Well, let's see here. Maybe I can.
Well, I wonder if I've got it on my computer. I wonder if I can jump.
It is in the email. I sent a core email with the.
Oh, I know. I was wondering if there's a way for me to just share my screen right now.
Oh.
So I've got the paper.
Yes, let me stop sharing my screen and I'll let you share your screen.
Okay. All right. Now, remind me how you do that again.
In the bottom right corner, on the white bar, there's a thing that says Present Now.
Ah, okay. Your entire. There we go. Okay. Well, I guess I got to turn on my camera first. Okay. All right. Is that working?
Let's see. I can't yet see it in the Google Meets. If you clicked your entire screen and you had the, that usually works a lot easier.
Oh, let me try it one more time. It's not that important, but let me try it one more time. And if it doesn't work, then it's. Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, let me pull out this. Okay, how about now?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, I just had a couple of quick points. Actually, I really like the paper because I think it brings up a lot of questions, about what scientists who are studying consciousness often don't really pay attention to. So the identity theory really, I think, was the first of the modern theories of consciousness that originally came out in the 50s, and actually there was a devastating paper by Hilary Putnam, the philosopher, that pretty much did away with identity theory for a long time. And his paper was actually about multiple realizability. Then that sort of turned to functionalism and computationalism. But I think if you get to some of the more modern people who are studying consciousness, like Michael Graziano, I think he's taking an approach that is a lot like this identity theory. So if you look at figure 3, I think this is an excellent point, because at some point you have to stop talking about the neural correlates of consciousness, and you have to say what is it, within the physical world that you're talking about. So, and that, I think this figure 3 summarizes the paper perfectly. And that, at some point you're going to get a neural event that you're going to say, well, this is consciousness. And I think that's what a lot of, like Graziano and maybe a lot of other scientists are saying, but sometimes I don't know that they pay attention to the to the philosophy. Now, the problem, though, with the identity theory, and my biggest problem with this paper, let me go back to page 10 here, is you kind of get into, what has been termed biological chauvinism, where, if you take this to the identity theory to the limit, which is kind of what they did in the paper, then you kind of get some absurd conclusions of, that these very specific, neurons are the only thing that could be, causing this kind of, feeling of red. And they comment, however, the type theory of identity does not rule out more substantial differences in the material substrate of mental states, especially across different biological species or non-living artifacts. But these, we believe, are not very plausible given the available evidence. And I would say, wow, that's a pretty big statement, because that's the available evidence is just their intuition versus someone else's. And going back to what Randall had said, with the identity theory, it's almost like you're looking for the neural correlates of the Tetris game, but all you have is, my Commodore 64, where I used to, way back in the day, had the first Tetris. And, you're actually saying that Tetris is these different transistors, and you're missing the whole abstract level of, if not functionalism, at least patterns and information. So I think that's the limit. I mean, I think that's where you're going to run into major problems. And then you get into, conclusions like them, where they're saying that, a brain emulation would not be anything like what a biological brain would be like. But, what's the real reason for that besides, biological chauvinism, that you're saying that there's something special about neurons as opposed to any other form of computation? So let me stop sharing my screen here. But anyway, so I think those are the really interesting questions. But I thought it was a good paper because a lot of neuroscientists are going this direction, but I don't know that they're paying attention to, what position that puts them in terms of the philosophy. So,
so do you think that having a much clearer definition of the states of consciousness would help, show that they're as far as the example of how they say there doesn't seem to be a proper correlation between among different substrates, but if you could more accurately define what that kind of state of consciousness is that you're referring to across those different substrates, could you, if you were to have a clear definition, could you say that then, well, we can emulate this because here this is what it's this is what is being produced by the substrate, and there is no difference between this kind of state of consciousness being produced on the substrate and as like a human, or or this substrate and like a horse, they're having the same state of consciousness. So I just want to make sure that I'm also picking up on your point that do you think that having a stricter definition of, or some better way of measuring the states of consciousness, would that help to determine whether or not the same kind of state can be present on different substrates?
Well, I think that's kind of part of the big challenge, is that you have to study consciousness and define it kind of at the same time. And so they have these figures about like the taste of coffee, where they're breaking down all these details in the phenomenology. And I thought that was very interesting because many people have tried that, and it kind of reminds me, if you know much about Bertrand Russell, and he tried to create a theory where everything, you start with just phenomena such as these very minimal types. So you start with the absolute minimal types of phenomenology, and you kind of recreate the world from there. But it just doesn't quite work, and so I'm not sure that it's ever going to be, you're going to be able to work backwards, as opposed to maybe taking a functionalist approach where you look at what differentiates the function between this taste and that taste. And of course, that's challenging too, because if you look at something like smell, I mean, it's just different molecules hitting the smell receptors, and what is, why is this molecule that has sulfur smelling that way? And so, yeah, I mean, it's challenging either way. If you try to go from the minimum phenomenology, or you try to take, a more third-person approach. And I think that's a challenge. I mean, yeah, you've got to make some progress there if you really want to, have a satisfying theory of consciousness.
I think either way, which direction you're coming at it from, it doesn't matter. It's going to be challenging. But in any case, just trying to have a relatively, I guess, detailed hierarchy or list of some kind would be helpful, just in the sense that then there's something that you can point to, that you can say, this is what I actually mean when I'm talking about the phenomenology of consciousness or the states of consciousness. And let's see, can you do this in a computer? Can you do this in a human? Can you do this in a cat? That allows you to talk about something more concrete than, say, and not to harp on IIT, et cetera, but say, we can measure the level of consciousness in this rock over here, and we can measure the level of consciousness in this computer, doesn't tell you a lot about what it's like to be a bat. Whereas having this hierarchical list of some kind, if you have enough detail in there, you can at least begin to approximate it, and then you can have papers where, say, someone will say, okay, we just made a computer program that can, in some sense, in some way, we've implemented all 15 of these. And then someone else can argue, yeah, but that's still not like human consciousness because, and then you can get into more detail rather than always sort of staying at 15,000 feet and just arguing about the approach to consciousness.
So do you think that maybe as far as emulation is concerned, do you think maybe if an efficient method would be first emulating just generalized types of, at least again, just going back to emulating consciousness itself, would you think it would probably be efficient to first emulate that general type and then go back to further defining states of consciousness and then emulating that? Or do you think maybe it needs, do you think understanding, or at least giving a target, a generalized target of consciousness type, do you think that might also need an individual?
I think this has a separate kind of value. So whether there is value to trying to emulate consciousness types separately from making a whole brain emulation for, say, C. elegans, Drosophila, or eventually humans, that's kind of a separate question, because the method used to get a practical emulation off the ground for any one of these organisms, they're typically such that you would imagine, at least as a functionalist, that if you got it right, that these types of consciousness that are being generated by those brains would be included when you're building parts of those brains or building the entire brains one way or another. I don't know what the consciousness of a Drosophila is like, but, whatever its experience of the world is, probably would be included in an emulation of its brain. So from an implementational point of view, it's not immediately clear whether there is an advantage to separating out consciousness and doing that. But I think that when it comes to getting people involved in whole brain emulation and making people look at it and say, you know what, it might be possible to create an emulation of a human brain, and it may be conscious, and it may seem like you're experiencing the world the way you normally do, and this could be you. These steps that are necessary in kind of the comprehension of the problem and understanding why it's relevant and why this approach deserves research, those can definitely be aided, in my opinion, by having concrete things to point to, such as saying, look, here's an artificial intelligence, a very simple program we made that is at least giving us a replica of some type of these consciousness phenomena, or something like that. Because then you have something very rigorous and specific to point to for the part of the conversation where people will claim something like, oh, but an emulation in a computer will never be conscious. Okay, then tell me in what way this artificial intelligence that we just built here is not conscious. So in that sense, I think it does have a special value, even if not on the same branch as going about, learning to build emulations of biological brains. It will have a value in terms of talking about, I guess, more the philosophy, really, behind whole brain emulation. Yeah.
I see. Okay, and so I can see now then why by having the neural states, or well, I guess more specifically, when you are engineering the emulation, this is why having the I suppose connectomic mapping, not necessarily neural states, but this is why having the images and the understanding of the neural kind of connections and all of that is important to the engineering, because you could basically, we have that information available through scanning, and so and I'm just following this train of thought, that is what will be the basis for the engineering, is what we scan and determine from.
The humble way for me to say the thing that I was saying about, I don't know if it makes sense from a point of view of how to implement emulations of biological brains, to take it separately. The humble way to say this is, we are too uninformed, we're too dumb about how brains work to be able to separate it out right now and say, okay, over here I'm going to make a separate emulation of the consciousness, and over there I'm going to make a separate emulation of its memory characteristics or personal characteristic memory. We see, we don't know how to separate those out. They're all in the neural block that's there, and we don't know how to pull them out and to do them separately like that. So we can do abstraction in the sense that we can say, let's make simpler neurons than the neurons that are in the brain, or we can make abstraction in the sense that we just want to build a circuit, like look at Ted Berger's work, that ultimately produces output the same way as the underlying neurons that are there. So that's kind of a top-down abstraction that we can do, but we're not very good at that lateral abstraction where we can say, pull out perception and build that in the machine on the left, and build consciousness in the machine on the right, and build personal memory in the machine over down in the hallway, and then connect those three machines, and that's your emulation of the human. We don't know how to do that separation. So that adds a level of complication that you don't encounter if you're just trying to, straightforward do an emulation of C. elegans, Drosophila, or human. So that's why when I talk about emulating consciousness as a separate thing, or conscious experience as a separate thing, I immediately talk about an artificial intelligence, because that's something where you can, like, de novo in a black box, come up with a way to design that. And then I'd love to see the response that, say, someone like Tononi has to that, or Chalmers, and what he thinks about the hard problem in that AI that is definitely acting as if it has conscious phenomenal experience.
Okay, I understand. Going back to personal identity, then, as like kind of an well, first I guess I should ask. Does anyone else have any other questions before we continue? And also, were there any questions posted in YouTube? Because I can't see that without leaving the screen. Okay, well then, just going back to identity, personal identity, I guess, as a way we can, as like an ending topic. Do you think that consciousness, well, I guess, is if consciousness as I understand, for as far as identity is concerned, the importance of consciousness is the way that it's the way that the identity uh, um, communicates it. Well, maybe not that's the right, maybe that's not the right word. Maybe it's the way that the identity perceives the external world. And so, as far as classifying identity, um, as far as its main subjects, memory, I think, is a pretty distinct subject. And then consciousness, that seems to be the interpretation of the individual with its outside world experiences. And by outside world, I mean like things that come through the senses and that gets turned into thought. And so, let's see. I guess what my question is that is that an accurate interpretation of how consciousness is important to personal identity? And then
Yeah, I think you're on the right track. And again, Mike Cirillo can correct me. I think that we do need to be careful to separate consciousness also from perception, because perception is our ability to, be aware of the world around us. Consciousness is being aware of ourselves in the world. So that's a little bit different. And I can imagine, for instance, that you could be in a sensory deprivation tank with no sensory input whatsoever, or at least hardly, and you can still be conscious. So there's an aspect of being aware of your own body and your own self in your body and your thoughts and all of that sort of thing as part of consciousness as well. It's very hard, besides the very general phenomena such as being able to feel pain, being able to express or feel a sensation of happiness, those sorts of things. Besides those very general ones, it's very hard for me to separate it away from our memory, because as soon as you get to how, what triggers any of those things, then it immediately starts to get connected with associations that we have, and all of the associations are mapped in synaptic change, and those are all memory. Memory isn't just remembering yesterday's menu. Memory is everything. It's how I walk. It's all of those things. So yeah. Sorry. I will get off my soapbox again.
thank you. Oh yeah, go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah. I mean, I definitely agree with Randall. I mean, yeah, consciousness and identity are definitely separate. Although I think you could say that consciousness seems to be one part of identity. When people often talk about personal identity, that's one part of it, but definitely not the whole thing. But that's a question. I mean, that's a whole nother topic in itself.
Thank you. I just had one last question. Do you, other than consciousness and memory, what would be another general category as far as what makes up personal identity that, like if you were to say maybe these are the 3 or plus like specific areas that we should look at when we're talking about personal identity, is there something maybe more obvious than just consciousness and memory? And like what would that be? What would be the title of that category?
Well, you might. I mean, it depends on how you define memory, because if you define it in the most abstract sense, and memory is not just episodic memory, but actually like your personality, like just dispositions and those kind of things. So if you define memory narrowly, just like episodic memory, then you'd have to include basically personality, characteristics as well. But if you define memory broad enough, then I think that's could be actually included in memory. But yeah, that's a good question. So memory and consciousness, and if memory includes personality, what else is there? What else is in there? And I don't know. It's a good
It's a good
question.
question. So if let's say we weren't trying to do a whole brain emulation of a human, just so that we can get down to something simpler. Let's imagine that we're doing a whole brain emulation of an imaginary thing, something that didn't even exist yet, like our artificial intelligence that is is a conscious artificial intelligence and a person in its own right, even if it's not human. So it needs to at least have memory and it needs to have conscious awareness, because once we turn it on, it would need to be able to be aware that it exists, be aware of its memories and its disposition, and how to react perhaps to something. So there's some input and some output, right? There's sensory perception. What else would it be missing? Is there anything else besides this perception, I/O, memory, and the ability to model itself and have a conscious awareness of itself? Is there anything else that we would need to have in that thing to say, oh, this is kind of like a simple little person?
I guess if you're going to compare it to just general computing, this granted this is crude, but if the consciousness is the interpretation of the input-output, and the memory is, well, the memory, then there would be something that you could compare to the stored programs, which is like what the computer.
Oh, okay. So just to interrupt there. So yeah, okay, memory storage. Let's just assume for a moment that things can be stored, whether it's permanent or whether it's fleeting in RAM. I'm not too worried about that. We can implement it whichever way, but there's some way to have memory. When I say that consciousness is its ability to be aware that it exists and to have a model of itself, that is a little bit more than just interpreting perceptual input. So perceptual input, processing perceptual input is one thing, but this is where we do make a distinction when we talk about consciousness. We say that you can completely unconsciously process input, and you can even show this in humans. Humans are able to unconsciously process input as well. But you can also be consciously aware of things. And sometimes that doesn't even need to include external input. It can just be your thoughts. So there has to be some part of this artificial intelligence, this person, this little example person that we're talking about, that would have to be a model of itself in its environment, in its world, that it's updating and where it can have aha moments. I think that's the really crux of giving it some kind of consciousness. And that's when you can then, of course, start all the debates and the papers about whether does this little AI actually have consciousness or not? What's missing?
Okay, yeah, okay, and thank you. Yeah, I apologize about the confusion. I now see I now have a better understanding of what you're, what consciousness, right? Because you could be consciously aware of like yourself, but you don't have to have like sensory input for that. Okay, then, it's yeah, uh, it seems, yeah, going back to like defining what would be like a third category, it almost seems like there might not be one, just different kinds of memory and different levels of memory and different levels of consciousness. Um, uh, as far as what makes up identity. Yeah, so I don't know what else would be like something to categorize as a separate aspect of research as far as like personal identity. Um,
Since we're out on this branch already, I'm just going to flippantly throw this out there. Are we equating identity to personhood right now, and what's the difference? What would give a system personhood? I know, it's a silly question. Maybe it has nothing to do with identity.
Well, philosophers have always defined person as like, the rational animal. So maybe you're getting into, not only consciousness, but a certain degree of intelligence, maybe. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
yeah, it almost seems like maybe person is person encompasses the identity, or well, maybe that's not accurate. Um, uh, Actually, or maybe it is. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, or personhood also. When you talk about personhood, you're talking about certain, rights and things like that. So, unfortunately, we don't.
It's difficult to define, isn't it? Because, I mean, when you say, like, a certain level of intelligence, and yeah, I get this. I mean, in Star Wars, a certain type of droid might have personhood and another kind of droid might not have personhood. But in the human world, do babies have personhood?
Well, that's a very debatable question. Definitely. And animals. I mean, how what kind of rights do animals have? Even though we know they're. I mean, most people would not deny that they're conscious, but we still don't treat them as persons because we don't. They really have no rights, which is a big part of personhood. So.
Yeah, the whole matter of legal personhood is a whole other problem, because then you've got companies that are persons, and you've got to wonder if they have all the other aspects of humanity.
Yeah, it seems like when you're getting into defining personhood, now is when you're defining values to the subject that has the identity, or like if you are talking about a third-person observation of what would be identifiable as a person, it seems like there are levels of obscurity. Like, for instance, going back to the droid example, at some point you could get the droid to mimic what would be considered a person, but then again, but if you keep on changing it little by little, you can see how it's like there are levels of its personhood. So and maybe person is more of a third party viewpoint definition.
Yeah, I suspect you're right, but I do feel like it always ends up, it's true that there is that aspect of what's being defined by society or by the third person or whatever in personhood, but personhood also does seem to involve identity, right? Like, they'll say that a specific person has a specific identity. So that's why my brain went there, because, that connection seems to exist.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't have
Anyway,
any...
I feel like we've gotten pretty far with this, and there was one other thing that was kind of on my mind is, so we've talked about neural correlates of consciousness right now, and we've talked about consciousness in a variety of ways for a little while. Is there such a thing as, does anybody talk about neural correlates of identity? Is that really a thing? Or is that just memory research?
I haven't seen anything that refers to that, like studies about finding neural correlates of identity rather than just consciousness. But at least thinking about it, it would seem that it would be taking in the neural correlates of memory, but also consciousness, and then the neural correlates of what would be between those, if there is something between those, something that can be separable from consciousness and memory. So I think that defining the or at least seeing the, well, looking for the neural correlates of identity, I think, would entail all of the neural correlates of consciousness, considering that the consciousness is an inseparable part of identity, but then it would also include the memory. I suppose the things that it would not include is if you are talking about the neural correlates that would correlate to some kind of abstract natural function like, well, heart regulation, or like temperature, like things that would
Yeah.
not matter to an emulation. Um, so that seems like if you are defining you first need to define uh, the cognitive functions that are essential for identity, and then then you can look at what the neural correlates are corresponding to those cognitive functions.
Okay. I guess just because we happen to be sort of on a discussion of various definitions and distinctions between terminology and on all that, which I think is useful, and people who care about mind uploading should care about these things. And I'm on a roll. I might as well go one step further. We've been talking about consciousness, and we've been talking about identity, and sometimes people talk about states of consciousness, and we talk about it as if there is a state of identity as well. Is Michael at this point in time? That's Michael right now. Like, how much is that Michael? Like the Michael of 5 minutes ago and whatnot. So we talk about states and conditions like that. But is that correct, or should we be talking about active processes? So, for instance, if I think about someone who is in cryonic storage at Alcor right now, it's very hard for me to say, consider that person conscious. That person is probably not conscious right now while they're, at nitrogen temperatures, at liquid nitrogen temperatures. So then does that mean that we also shouldn't be referring to them as having the same identity? Is Bill stored at Alcor still Bill? Because after all, we said identity requires both consciousness and memory, and I don't really think they're conscious right now. Is being potentially conscious or having the potential information to restore consciousness enough to say that a person's identity is preserved and that they are there, that this is therefore Bill?
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And there actually is I can't remember who it was. I'll see if I can track down that article, but they actually defined identity as potential identity just because of scenarios that you're, exactly talking about. They actually came up with, definitions of identity where it was the potential, maybe the potential to be conscious or to, that kind of potential. So, yeah, I'll see if I can track that down. I'm trying to remember who that was now, but, because that like exactly the examples you said, that brings up, cryonics or all these other, uploading scenarios, just what, how are you going to define it?
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, so as far as cryonics, the correlates the neural correlates for consciousness would have to be preserved in the cryonics. So it would have to be frozen in that state, but they must also then be revivable. I suppose you could say that if the neural correlates for consciousness in Bill were destroyed during the cryonic process, then given the criteria for consciousness being part of identity, you could then say that unfortunately Bill did not survive the cryonic procedure.
But if it turns out that consciousness is a fairly simple, general thing that all human brains possess, then perhaps if we can restore Bill's memory as we create a new brain for Bill, and then a new consciousness emerges in there, that still builds consciousness with Bill's memory, right? His identity could be preserved even if we replace his consciousness like we replace his heart.
Then yes, then even if you also were going to say the same thing, you could say the same thing for memory if you were able to emulate.
But you see where I just got us, right?
Yes.
Now we have to wonder if we need to strike consciousness from our list of things required for identity, just like the heart.
Well, interesting, because then you get into things like the memory transfer scenarios. A's memories are slowly transferred into B, and vice versa, and all those interesting scenarios. Which is a good point, because consciousness seems to be not. It's just a general function.
Yeah,
at that point.
Most of us don't seem to care too much whether we replace the retina and other parts that are necessary for visual perception as long as I can still recognize my grandmother. So we may not consider those things essential for identity preservation and transfer and whole brain emulation. The same thing is probably true for the heart, and it may turn out that the same thing is true for consciousness, that consciousness is such a general thing, being able to feel happy, being able to feel pain, all that sort of stuff, and being able to be aware of your own body, that you could put in a replacement program for that as long as you still had your memories. And so consciousness is not an essential part of identity.
Yeah, I can see that, especially compared to memory, because memory is incredibly unique. Granted, I suppose you could have a completely coincidental situation where two individuals have the exact same memory. I don't know how that would be possible, but it's, I mean, if they, were
Well, mind uploading and then copying, that's how that's possible.
Right, okay. Yeah, then, well, in that case, then, if they, yeah, if they had the same memory, then at that instant, they would be the same identity until those copies got to the point where they were able to build different memories, which is just matters about giving it time. Then,
Yeah.
okay.
No, exactly. And so I like that we're getting here, because these are things that, I wonder who's going to listen to those, to the recording of this journal club all the way through to the end. But there's stuff here that would be useful for people to think about if they think about mind uploading, because you have to start thinking about what things are actually what you're really talking about when you mean you want to persist, you want to survive uploading. And yeah, your memory is important, but then if you make copies, there are branch points, like Michael Cirillo's paper points out, branching, right? But also, because of memory plasticity, it's not a thing that stays the same. So who we are changes over time. So then if we already change over time anyway, then what would it matter if when you were recreated, if 10% of you was lost? You would still survive, probably, right? So that brings up additional considerations of what are the thresholds for successful mind uploading.
Yes. I think this is an excellent thing to bring into. We can continue this discussion in our winter workshop. I think that's a great way to start. Let's see. As far as the discussion, I didn't have any further thoughts or anything to add. Does anyone have any questions, comments? I suppose I could take a look at the YouTube to see if there are any questions. But I'll leave the floor open right now to anyone else.
Well, it sounds like you did a great job, Michael.
Excellent, thank you.
Now, do we have enough people here that we can find a volunteer for the next journal club?
Let's see. Well, I'll ask. Would anyone participating like to volunteer to present the journal club for the February journal club? And the date for that would be the first Sunday. So.
So I'll say that if no one else raises their hand, then I am happy to do a February one. Just mentioning that.
Well, and for the future too, maybe not February, but at some point, it might be interesting to look at that Hillary Putnam article on multiple realizability. And I mean, I could present that, sometime down the road. It's good to know. I mean, it's good to read the classic papers, and where people really want to refer back and forth. So because I'd like to reread that because it's been a while. So at some point, I would definitely do that one.
Well, okay, so we've got at least two possible presenters here. Is there any third person who hasn't yet presented who might want to? I don't know who else is actually here.
It's a great way for students to get experience, learn, presenting articles. So I don't know if we have any grad students or anyone else here, but it's always good to practice.
Okay, in any case. Oh, hey. Hello.
Hello. I'm pretty new to this, but I would be interested as well at some point. I don't know if for the next one would be the best option, but maybe the one after that.
Okay, so why don't we do this? You'll have the one in March, and then Michael Cirillo and I will fight each other for the one in February.
Oh, you can take. I volunteer to give it away to you. You can take that one, so now I can do April
Really?
if no one
Because
else wants it.
I am curious about the Putnam article, so there's something to that, and it feels like we're sort of on a roll right now with the topic. So maybe,
Yeah.
Are you feeling like it's maybe too much to do it by February? Is that why you're saying later, but not
Well,
right now?
yeah, just to make sure. I mean, I probably could do it, but just all things considered, it'd probably be easier for me to. Well, you know what? Either way, I mean that's. I mean
Okay,
that's not going to
then
be a
in that
problem.
case, I would really like to hear about the Putnam article. So
Okay.
if you don't mind doing it in February,
Yep,
then
that's
please
fine.
do.
I'll do that.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and if you wanted to use the second Sunday to give yourself more time, that would be acceptable.
Let me take a peek at the calendar. Wow, it's only the 12th, so yeah, that's the first February. So it'd be the second. Yeah, that's fine. No, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, excellent. Thank you. With that, to all of our audience members, thank you very much for uh, participating in the January Carboncopies Foundation Journal Club meeting. Our next presenter will be Mike Sorello on February 2nd. And this discussion also will, as a side note, we will also have this topic in our 2020 Winter Workshop livestream event, which will be on the topic of identity. And so, with that, everyone, thank you very much. I'll go ahead and end the live stream here.